This is the Mathematics Education Podcast from mathedpodcast.com. Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri. Today I'm very happy to be joined by someone who you might know from writing as Herbert Khuzwayo, but who I know as Becky. Becky, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Saman.
Becky is a faculty member in the Faculty of Education at the University of the Western Cape here in South Africa, and I'm going to be really excited to talk to him about a chapter that he's recently written. And the chapter is about occupation of our minds, a metaphor to explain mathematics education in South Africa in the apartheid era. And that chapter is in a book called Numeracy as Social Practice, which is edited by Yasukawa, Rogers, Jackson, and Street. So this is a really interesting metaphor about occupation of our minds. But Becky, before we get to that, I want to just back up for a second, get a little bit of your background. So where did you do your dissertation work, and what was the topic of your dissertation?
Yes, I did my PhD with Aalborg University in Denmark.
Okay.
It was a collaborative project between that university in Denmark and the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which is in KZN in KwaZulu-Natal, which is in the eastern part of the country, which is, by the way, a historical white university, because that is the language we understand in South Africa, and
right.
which we still use quite often. So this project actually involved us, because I participated with about, say, 4 or 5 other colleagues in the project. And we had our supervisor, who was coming from that university, Professor Ole Skofsmoshe, and he would come here and then would go to Denmark from time to time to the university, and he will come to do his supervision here in the country.
Okay. That's great. Now, you mentioned the history of South Africa, and of course what a lot of people might know is the turbulent era, the apartheid era that was happening. And in this chapter that you wrote about occupation of our minds, you talk about the prominence of the technical curriculum that really was in place during apartheid. And I want to start by just asking you, what do you mean when you say the technical curriculum was really dominant?
Yes, my understanding of the technical curriculum, by the way, I did a study on the history of mathematics education in South Africa during the apartheid years, because you must understand that that was a very difficult and complicated time for us, whereby at one stage we had something like 17 departments of education in this country. We had the department that was looking after, white, students, black students. We had all kinds of a highly segregated kind of education. And I decided to do this study just to understand as to what actually happened. And, during the apartheid years, how did we learn maths? Because I was a student during that time, and also I became a teacher at high school during that time, and also I've taught at the university. So I did that historical study, which was really quite complicated to do in that because of this highly segregated system that we have. But so I think therefore, and my whole idea of a technique curriculum comes from actually that study. And my understanding is that, talking about the technique curriculum is a situation whereby, for instance, teachers of mathematics are provided with a toolbox, sort of full of techniques which are drilled in the minds of the learners and which they have to master. During the apartheid years, it was very clear that black kids were to be prepared in techniques which they will need to take over the key positions within their own community. Therefore, and which will take also the consideration of the cultural background of the child.
Yeah.
So this technical curriculum actually has to ensure that that happens. Teachers therefore become the victim of a system which assigns to them the task of implementing a ready-made what we call curriculum and testing students on these techniques.
So one aspect of the technical curriculum is that it's technical skills that are kind of drill, like rote memorization, and then practice this skill over and over again, which to us kind of seems like lower cognitive demand kind of processes. So in that sense, it's like focused on skill techniques.
Yes.
And then the other part of it, though, is that it's not a random or arbitrary set of skill and techniques. Those skills and techniques have been chosen by the powers that be.
Exactly.
In a certain way, because they're kind of like funneling the population into a certain place. So it's not just that it's drill and kill, and it's not just that it's rote memorization. It's also certain kinds of skills because we want to set you up for a certain kind of future.
No, exactly. And with that kind of curriculum being in place, therefore, it is a potential actually to make learners not to see the alternatives, in mathematics, and their minds therefore really become occupied. And you must understand that in South Africa at the time of apartheid education, there was this dominant, philosophical foundation of education which was based on fundamental pedagogics. And fundamental pedagogics actually emphasize quite a lot, on the teacher being, an authoritative figure, and the learner, is always to follow this and actually take everything. So there was no opportunity for opening up, with the learners, to make them sing alternatives, to make them question anything, etc. Because of this philosophy, which actually was very dominant and which could be found in every aspect of what learners were subjected to. And therefore, I'm saying therefore that there was the occupation of knowledge about mathematics learning and teaching.
So now you're really getting into this central metaphor of the chapter. So the chapter is called Occupation of Our Minds, and that comes from Fasha's concept of occupation, which is from Palestine, where the Israelis are kind of occupying Palestinian land, but also occupying the minds and the education of the Palestinians. And you're bringing that metaphor over here to South Africa is what you're talking about now. So I wonder if you could just help us fill in that metaphor a little bit more. So how do you see in South Africa the different levels of the occupation, and then maybe say a little bit more about the occupation of our minds? It sounds like it's what's being taught, but it's also who controls the knowledge and who gets to dictate what is learned.
Yes. I found this notion from, as you have correctly mentioned, Fashach, who is Palestinian himself. Fashach uses this notion in explaining that, in talking about the fact that, the Palestinians did play and have always played a crucial role in waging a war against the occupation of their land and resources. However, he is critical of the Palestinian curriculum, particularly maths curriculum, being mathematics education, person himself, which he claims has been meaningless and not built on aspects and issues of the Palestinian reality. He's even more critical of the insensitive and unresponsive nature of mathematics curriculum, and then he concludes, if I may quote, the maths we teach and study, at least in the schools and university in Palestine, is basically like a corpse that does not feel anything of its surrounding. He says, therefore, that Palestinian people, it did not only have the occupation of their land, but also their minds, were somehow occupied. And well, of course, it talks about what characterizes this occupation, and I won't perhaps go much deeper into that. So it is a situation whereby students are depositories and the teacher is the depositor, and there is lack of diversity, and standardized thinking is encouraged. And therefore, he says the Palestinian people actually needed to free themselves from this occupation. And then I looked at this metaphor, what it meant in the Palestinian situations, and I looked at it in our own South African situation, particularly during the apartheid years. And that is when, therefore, I'm applying this metaphor to what happened actually during the apartheid years, and having been a student of mathematics, having been a teacher of mathematics, and so many things, I looked at, and I would question so many things. But, this study provided me an opportunity actually to look deeper at what is it that it was taught to us, how it was taught, and who taught it, etc., etc.
Yeah, so I'm kind of in my own mind trying to identify the main factors. It sounds like one of them is, you mentioned the standardized way that mathematics is presented, like there's one way to do this mathematics problem. You also mentioned the lack of diversity. So if they push one way of doing it, and then if the students and the learners buy into that, they think like, well, of course that's how it is. There's only one way to do this math problem. There's only one way to do that. There's only one way to do that. That's a sign that they've kind of been occupied in their minds, right? Because they've begun to believe that there's only one way to do it, or there's only one way that mathematics exists, instead of a diversity of ways or alternative options. So for me, one element is the standardization, the lack of diversity. But the occupation of the mind is also when the learner starts to just think that, of course, that's how mathematics is.
Yes.
Right? And that's actually not how mathematics has to be. Mathematics can have alternative perspectives or different ways of doing things. And mathematics could be more responsive to your everyday life. It could actually resonate with things that are going on for people. Yeah. Whereas, like Fasha said, the math curriculum seems dead. It doesn't seem to actually relate to people. Yes. And if your mind is occupied, you think that math is just neutral and it is this like separate static thing. But that means your mind is occupied, because you could break free from that and realize the math curriculum could be more responsive. It could be more culturally connected to people.
Yes, but sometimes people can argue that, you look at how mathematics is taught in many contexts, and this is how mathematics teaching looks like. In many contexts, students, this is not promoted. Their views, etc., etc. So what was different about South Africa? And you see, the thing in South Africa, I've mentioned to you that we had fundamental pedagogics which really dominated every aspect. Dominated, it was a philosophy that sort of justified, apartheid education, and actually that stress that the child had to submit to authority of the teacher, and the teacher has always to lead a child to adulthood, blindly or so, as a child. So therefore, in South African situation, it had to conform to the policy at a time, and it has to be seen in whatever was taught in South Africa and in how it was taught. And if I may go back to the time when apartheid was still at its height, and talking about the guy who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, and he made one of the most damaging statements in terms of relations when he was about to take up to become a Minister of Education. And this is what he says, and I want to quote this. He said, when I have control over native education, I will reform it so that the natives will be taught from childhood that equality with European is not for them. People who believe in equality are not a desirable teacher for blacks. What is the use of teaching blacks mathematics when they cannot use it in practice? And he said the idea is quite absurd. So we had somebody there during this time who made it sure that, blacks children could not excel or even go as much as, anybody else in mathematics because they just are not able because of their culture. You must understand that the whole notion of culture has been severely corrupted. Was severely corrupted in South Africa during the time of apartheid. So in other words, as a black child, it's not your fault that you do not understand certain concepts. It's because of your culture, because you are rooted in that culture, and that culture has got some limitation that you cannot be like, a white child. It's not a fault, it's a fact, it's there. And therefore, this is how, apartheid education actually looked like. So you must understand, therefore, in terms of teaching teachers this mathematics, there was in a way that a dominant thinking amongst those who taught mathematics that, as black children, they can understand certain things, etc., etc.
Yeah. An official leader is actually saying on the record,
yes,
the idea of equality between the races should not even come up. The opposite should be taught. Like, we should teach them that the races are not equal. And then he specifically says math is not for black students. Like, to say so explicitly the racist kind of education policy is really striking.
Yes, and I want to say, for instance, that as part of my broader historical research in mathematics education, I had the opportunity to look specifically at the kind of research which was done on blacks by white people, because you must realize that the opposite was not true.
This is the education research. But yes, it was white researchers.
It was white researchers.
They were studying blacks.
Yes,
black
on
learners.
Blacks. Yes, and I wanted to look at that statement of Herbert and what some academics, the kinds of research findings that they would come up with. I want to quote one of those, and it states that blacks are retarded as regards visual perceptual development. That in contrast with whites, they reveal an inability to report depth perception and to interpret three-dimensionally. That their concept of space differs radically from that of whites. That they experience problems even in experiencing pictures and figures analytical. That they do not have a clear understanding of concepts like circumference, length and width, and generally find arithmetical concept difficult to master. In that kind of research, therefore, you can see the thinking about, blacks learning mathematics. It had to do with, their culture. The problem is who you are. The problem is your culture. So you can never be able to, to go as far as you like, because there are certain concepts, there are certain things which you will not understand.
And the fact that it's written by a researcher who has kind of authority of knowledge, supposedly.
And people got their PhDs out of this of research. And I can quote you, I can actually expose you to a number of those researchers which were actually doubting the true mathematical ability of a black child.
I want to ask you about right now in 2018. It's been more than 20 years since the freedom and democracy came in 1994 to South Africa. But as you say in the chapter, the occupation of the mind did not end just because of Nelson Mandela's election and that sort of thing. the problems and the biases and things that were infused in the apartheid era are still around even now. How do you see things now? Like, where do you still see occupation of the mind happening even present day?
Okay. One thing Fashar talks about is that, first of all, you must start off by shaking off all the debt that was accumulated, in our case, during the what you call the times of apartheid. And that is such a process, actually, to change the way people were made to believe about themselves, about their ability to do mathematics, etc., etc. But that should be your start. Coming to the present, where are we as far as mathematics is concerned? I will say, unfortunately, we have experienced a number of changes with the curriculum. Because, trying to normalize a situation which was so abnormal, trying to put people together and trying to say, we are all equal. Now putting people at the starting line of the race, and that is a challenge on its own.
Yeah.
But coming to me, when it first, soon after the democratic government came to power, then we had this outcomes-based curriculum which was introduced, which was very kind of flexible and which really attempted to undo all these beliefs and the things that I'm talking about. When that was done away with, unfortunately, for reasons which I understand as to why, for instance, there were problems with outcomes-based curriculum in South Africa, and the kind of openness and the kind of what you call attempts to free teachers from the occupation.
To give them a lot of flexibility.
To give them a lot of flexibility. I know the reasons. When that was done away, however, I think we lost quite a bit. Because now what we have is a kind of technique curriculum that we spoke of earlier on, whereby strict as sort of very much again control the curriculum, what teachers should be teaching, at what time, what the syllabus prescribed must be taught, etc. We were back to that time, which really gives little freedom. Let me give you one example of what happened when that curriculum actually was put aside. And in mathematics curriculum, we had for the first time in each and every chapter, we had, for instance, the adoption, an attempt to adopt the historical perspective, in the teaching of each and every what you call a concept or
like
topic.
Some history of mathematics was integrated.
Some history of mathematics.
And the people involved.
Yes, especially. You talk about fractions. Let's go into the history. And not a long thing, but just to make them understand, because you must understand that one thing the history of mathematics will do is actually to try to close this gap, to think of mathematics as something, some ideas that just fell from the air and sort of, and when names of people are mentioned, etc., that was very useful. But that was so. In other words, what I'm saying, therefore, so many things should have changed. But the fact of the matter is that now we're back to square one, whereby the experts have to dictate about,
So they tried some of that stuff, but it wasn't received very well, and so then you're kind of backtracking to more prescriptive, narrow, kind of technical things.
Exactly. And because that was actually justified on the fact that because of apartheid education, so many teachers were not well qualified, we had very few mathematics teachers. Teachers had problem about delivering the content, because There were problems, and therefore there needed to be some control and of things, much more, because teachers were saying, we don't know what to do, how to teach all this stuff here.
Yeah. Speaking about your chapter, Occupation of Our Minds, at the end of the chapter, you try to give some hope. You talk about some ways of trying to end the occupation, or at least reduce the effects of the occupation of the mind. So I was wondering if people should get the chapter to have the full story here, but I wonder if you could give us a small sample of some of the things that you've thought about for trying to make progress, try to improve the situation with respect to the occupation of the minds.
Okay. Ending occupation, for instance, what are the kinds of things that I'm talking about? I'm talking about, for instance, incorporating Ubuntu in the teaching and learning mathematics. Incorporation of Ubuntu. What is Ubuntu?
Yeah, what is Ubuntu?
Yeah. Ubuntu is a Nguni term, and it's called in different names. Ubuntu sort of philosophy constitutes humans as being endowed with certain virtues such as kindness, respect, sympathy, a cooperative spirit, concern for each other's welfare, etc., etc. Ubuntu recognizes, is against individualism, for an example. Ubuntu says, I am who I am mainly because of other contribution of other people, Ubuntu construes, therefore, people's knowledge, perceptions, and the behavior patterns in accordance with social norms. So, therefore, it can take us a lot of time to actually say how does this translate into mathematics. But the bigger picture is that I would want to actually teach mathematics in a way that actually begins to actually incorporate all these essential elements of what constitutes Ubuntu. Let me give you an example. In some of the courses that we teach here, I do a lot of work on the history of mathematics. My third-year students, I expose them to a lot of things, and you can see, for instance, some material which I have here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. All this material is actually made by students having, studied a particular history. Each student or a group of 2 or 3 students would actually choose a topic from the curriculum. At any level, they would actually choose whatever topic that they feel comfortable with, and they would actually trace the history of that topic. And actually, it's such a long project. They would trace, and they will be doing presentations about that, and they will actually be doing things like you are seeing here, which are not mean. So students, therefore, they are free to look at things, and the amount of education I have received in the past myself, it's really amazing about certain things that I was not aware of, mainly because I give students that opportunity to say, I recognize them, I recognize their potential actually to learn things and come back and teach the whole class and teach me as their, what you call, lecturer, etc., etc. So, to me, Ubuntu therefore would embrace that kind of recognition, recognizing people's potential, etc., etc. And Ubuntu would support teachers who would be coming with their own innovative ways of teaching mathematics. And actually recognizing and supporting students who are involved in some interesting problem. Students who are coming up with new things as a result of actually having studied a particular topics in mathematics, and we are there to actually provide that kind of support. I'm talking about a situation whereby my learners, for instance, will be able to integrate knowledge across, say, disciplines, integrating knowledge within the discipline of mathematics itself, and actually, rather than seeing mathematics, as isolated kind of bit of knowledge, learners were. So, to me, therefore, that talks to what Ubuntu should be about or is all about. So, therefore, freeing people from occupation of seeing things, as fixed and having nothing to do with them. Therefore, I think ending occupation, therefore, will begin by actually trying to do the kind of things that I'm already trying in my small way, to do with my students.
Yeah. I encourage the listener to find the chapter, because you have also another list that you've kind of compiled that we can't go through all of them here, but some other practical things that can be more empowering, recognizing the individuality and the collective nature of the learners and the society. And it's really kind of a nice ending to the chapter. And again, that chapter is called Occupation of Our Minds, a metaphor to explain mathematics education in South Africa in the apartheid era. And that's in the book Numeracy as Social Practice, Global and Local Perspectives from Routledge. But I've been speaking with Becky Khuzwayo, also known as Herbert Khuzwayo. Becky, thanks so much for sharing a little bit of your ideas, the things you've been working with and thinking about here. Before we end, I want to ask you one final question. This we can kind of step to the side of maths education a little bit. If you were not in mathematics and math education at all, you were just doing something completely different with your life, can you imagine another career, whether that be just something fun or something that you realistically could have done as an alternative?
Sometimes I avoid talking about myself so much, but in this case, I think I will do. I come from very humble beginnings. A boy who grew up.
You couldn't see 3 dimensions?
Yes. A boy who grew up in a very rural settings, a boy who for the first 6 to 8 years could not, would go to school for 12 kilometers a day without a shoe in his feet, etc., etc. So I grew up in those humble beginnings, coming from a family of 8 boys, so things were really tough for all of us. But I'm where I am today, having been able to study mathematics up to the university level, having been a Fulbright scholar, and having attended, I did my master's in mathematics education at the University of Leeds, and then my PhD, and I've participated in international research projects, etc. So why I'm telling you all of that. My earlier background, growing up in those rural settings and seeing my parents actually sort of getting into farming, and with the money that they got from that, helping us. So therefore, I think for me, up to today, I really value that kind of life, I was looking after my father's sheep and cattle. Before I go to school, I make sure that, I keep them in a camp, and then that would give me some. So I really learned so much in that life, and therefore now that I'm here, and what else I would have done, I would really want to do such things, go into farming and yeah, because I value that life. I value the kind of life, we learned in the rural areas, etc., etc. So I think I would like to go to farming. Yes.
Visiting here, we've been able to drive out into the country a little bit. We've only been in the Western Cape, but we've gone out to the east quite a ways and up, and there's a lot of beautiful farming here in South Africa. And so to be part of that, I can definitely imagine the appeal of the countryside and the animals and things.
Yes. No, it will really be great. But here I am. I think I'm a teacher, and teaching for me is not something that came just by chance. But I think I've always been a teacher since I was a student.
Yeah.
I've been always fascinated by sharing knowledge with others.
Well, Becky, thanks for sharing knowledge here in this conversation, and the metaphor that you've been working with, I think others will also find meaningful, and they can apply it in different areas. So thanks so much for speaking with me about it.
Thank you.